Hello, and welcome to the Questions and Answers edition of the Thriving Kids podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Anderson. In last week's episode, Dr. Janine Dominguez and I talked about how to parent a teen through the challenges of adolescence, from mood swings to growing independence. This week, I'll be answering your follow-up questions on anything from emotional outbursts to communication breakdowns to setting boundaries that stick. Let's get into it. So for the first question here on the Teens Q&A episode, and I just want to tell you folks who are settling in to listen while you're doing the dishes or taking a walk, these questions span a wide range of topics. We're going to answer a bunch of them. This is going to be the most ambitious Q&A Thriving Kids podcast episode that we have had thus far. So here we go. Question number one that we got from our listeners. How do I stay connected to my teen when they constantly push me away? So what we think about as therapists, and I think this is what we're trained on when we're first working with teens and adolescents, is how you engage in those initial relationship building skills that build trust, that help people to, feel like you are interested in what they're interested in and that you're wanting to connect with them on kind of their terms. I always say to parents, let's flip back to those skills and think about what we do with teens when we're just trying to build a basic sense of trust and a basic investment in the relationship. Because the issue is that when a teen is constantly pushing you away, usually it's because our role as parents has pushed into the zone of either criticism or giving them a ton of different things to do on their list, or just kind of each interaction is about, something that they need to catch up on, something they need to do for school, something that we're disappointed about, a relative they need to write a thank you note to, any number of things. Because the reality is that teenagers, they want to tell us that they're independent, and at the same time, they're still wildly dependent on us as parents and caregivers. And there's this kind of push-pull of adolescence that we constantly see, where as parents, we want to kind of unhinge ourselves from that as much as we can and say, look, they're pushing me away because this is part of their way of becoming more independent as a teen, or they're pushing me away because they're annoyed because I'm reminding them of what it means, like the kind of chasm that there is between actually adulting and what they're doing where they think they're really independent. All of that is to say we can bridge that gap. So we tell parents, start with just thinking about how you talk. So if we can dial down a bit of the criticism, dial down the number of questions we're asking, or dial down the number of things we're telling a teen to do, and then dial up certain other ways of speaking, we're more likely to see a teen perhaps, push us away a bit less. So when we dial up certain things, it's more about commenting with interest on what they might be doing. So we're walking into a room, and instead of thinking, okay, I've only got 3 minutes where they're orbiting through this space, I've got to remind them of X, Y, and Z, it's instead looking at what they're already doing and saying, oh, I notice you're doing X. Or I saw it was kind of cool earlier that you were doing this. Now, parents frequently ask, for some reason as parents and caregivers, it's more difficult for us to feign interest in what teens are interested in, and people have more difficulty in wrestling with that than they do with little kids. We do it with little kids all the time. The number of times we feign interest in the Legos they're building or the art project that they're doing or any number of things isn't really, something that we count or kind of bristle at when it's young kids, because we consider that to be more of a developmentally appropriate thing. But teens need it just as much. If it's something they're watching, if it's something they're playing, if it's something they're engaged in, if it's a homework assignment they're working on, if it's a conversation topic with friends, no matter how vapid it might seem, you want to just kind of express some level of interest, and you want to express that, you're interested in kind of hearing more of what their thoughts are about that. So the way you do this is you comment on either what they're talking about, you comment on what they're doing, or you can reflect on what they're talking about. So reflection is just a fancy therapist term for if your teen says something, you just kind of paraphrase it as a statement. They say, yeah, I got to tell you, my friend Cindy today, she was just super mean at school. I don't know what's going on with her. Oh, okay, you're telling me Cindy's having a rough time. You're just trying to paraphrase it far enough away from what the person said that doesn't sound like you're playing the copycat game the little kids play, but at the same time, we want them to know that we're really actively listening and we're hearing what's going on. So the more validating comments and reflecting comments we can muster up, the better. Even if, again, we're still seething in the background at something that they haven't done or something we think they need to remember. It's all of those skills that help people to feel like we're actively listening to what they're saying, we're trying to work through it, we're hearing what matters to them, we're commenting on what they're doing. Now, the biggest aspect of this, the cherry on top of getting someone to stop pushing you away, is to not end the interaction by doing the thing that's been in the back of your head the entire time, which is tell them something to do or criticize something. Just walk away. If you have it within you, maybe you say something like, "It was nice chatting with you," or "Really cool to watch you play that game on your computer." If you can tie it up with a nice little bow like that, saying that you really thought the experience was kind of nice or you really enjoyed it, what you're doing, and I say this to parents all the time, is you're violating expectations. You're basically saying to a teen, as much as you expect me to come into a room and be like, "You need to finish your math project," instead you came in and said all these other things. And then what it does is it makes it so that someone says to themselves, "Wait a second, that person didn't give me anything else to do. They didn't tell me I was doing something wrong. I mean, that was just kind of nice." And what we're hoping is that over time, with a few more of those interactions, a teen might start orbiting by you and testing you, throwing out certain things that are in the teenage world and seeing how you react. And if you can stay kind of regulated, reflect a little bit of what they're saying, validate how difficult it is to kind of navigate the teen world, comment on what they're doing with interest, those are generally the processes for any human that help to build some level of trust and kind of mutual interest in what's going on in the relationship, so a teen stops seeing you as their taskmaster and starts seeing you perhaps as more someone that they can relate to or bring some of the things that they're struggling with. Our next question, I realize that was a really long-winded answer to that question, but that was a really important one because we get that right off the bat. But our next question is, what should I do when my teen explodes over even the smallest things? So this relates to the first question because what we're seeing is that it's common for teens to push adults away. It's common for teens to act with some level of irritability. And part of this is because how they're coding the world in adolescence. We hear from a lot of teens that they'll hold it together in school and try to be respectful of attachment figures there. And in the meantime, they're trying to navigate their social world, which already is super hard when you're already being really hard on yourself, feeling like your self-esteem might be in question, trying to figure out your identity, that when you get home, parents, caregivers, family members often get kind of the worst of you. You may be a little bit ashamed of that, but that doesn't necessarily change your behavior oftentimes as a teenager. Even now, I'd consider myself quite a nice person. I consider my parents quite nice. When I reflect on my teen years, pretty much the most, the most explosive things that I said or some of the meanest things that I might have said in the heat of an argument were pretty much all to family members. Those are the folks who we love the most and at the same time get sometimes the bottom of the barrel of kind of our interactional patterns. So what we try to talk with parents about is this notion that if teen emotion regulation is somewhat unpredictable, you want to be thinking about this the way that behaviorists think about it, which is first, let's show teens that we can stay regulated over certain things. That's modeling emotion regulation. And then secondly, let's think about three processes: reinforcing, ignoring, and then giving consequences for things. So if a teen actually reacts to something that we think might be stressful or might be a challenge, and they do well with it, or they seem to kind of interact with us well around it, we want to reinforce that. I was so impressed with how you did X, or how you dealt with this challenge, or how you just kind of talked to me about it. Kid to parent, that kind of stuff. That can be really helpful in having this be present in our minds in future interactions when we're dealing with challenges. And a teen might be able to say, you know what, I can kind of confront this with a parent. The second thing is ignoring or redirecting. So in that sense, if somebody explodes over a small thing, maybe the best way to help it to go away, if we think it's going to be short-lived, is maybe we don't react to that particular explosion. We look at that as something that might have been about somebody else. We don't code it as this incredibly overt disrespect and instead think of it as like they're dealing with their feelings. And, either we don't say anything about it, or we kind of use an if-then where we say, look, as soon as we're a little bit, calmer or cooler heads can prevail, I'd love to return to this conversation. Or we kind of redirect. And instead of going, harder on that particular subject, we instead say to somebody something else that might be more innocuous or that changes the subject or that gets us off on another topic. I was thinking about what we're doing tomorrow, what we're doing this weekend, or how we're going to manage taking you to your game and your sister to her orchestra practice. And you're just kind of switching to low emotional stakes topics in the hope that you see a teen cool off, and then maybe you can have a little bit more civil conversation over smaller things. But the more we think about those processes, modeling, catching a kid being good in the event that they react to challenges well, ignoring or redirecting in moments of like kind of mild explosion to more, or I would say less emotionally laden topics. And then in the event that someone's really, really overtly disrespectful or angry to the level of physical aggression or destruction of property, those are the moments where we really encourage parents of teenagers to impose consequences, whether that be on the child's social life, whether that be on the teen's, access to certain devices or screens, whether that be access to allowance, any number of things. But we can kind of talk through, what those consequences might look like with the teen in the event that they continue to engage in that type of behavior. So our third question, how do I help my teen deal with failure or rejection? So when we get this question from parents, first we want to kind of normalize this for both the parent and the teen. A lot of the teenage years involve getting used to failure and rejection, and this is actually a good part of development. We know from research that being exposed to a mild or moderate amount of adversity is actually good for helping us develop coping skills. We don't want kids to not be exposed to any adversity, failure, or rejection, because then it becomes something they just don't know how to cope with when they encounter it in the future after they're out of that kind of protective nest. And at the same time, we don't want teens to be exposed to too much adversity, because obviously that can be traumatic or incredibly stressful, things like that. We're trying to keep it in kind of a Goldilocks zone. So the first thing we do is we normalize it. We try to say that, like, look, we know that being rejected by somebody you're interested in romantically, or being ostracized by a friend, or finding yourself not to have performed academically as much as or as well as you wanted, or not making that particular group at school that you auditioned for, or the play at school, or not making a particular team, these are all typical parts of development. If we feel like a teen wants to hear from us about self-disclosure, we might be able to talk about some of our own failure, rejection experiences. We start briefly, and then if they seem to want to hear more, maybe we give them a little bit more of the story, but that can be somewhat relatable in realizing that things don't always change across adolescence in each generation. And then beyond that, what we try to remind someone is to put this in context. So we've normalized it. We've let them know that we've had experiences with this if they want to hear about them. And then beyond that, we try to say what we hope they might be able to do in at least their own self-talk in coping with this kind of encounter or this kind of like experience. So if they have failed or if they have been rejected, what we can remind them of is, here are all the great ways that you've been trying at various points. Let's look at the data of moments where you've tried similar situations and been at least mildly successful. Let's look at other friendships where you've been successful. Let's kind of pivot to the fact that 99% of the romantic prospects that you pursue in life might not work out. So let's just kind of focus on still playing the odds and not really focusing on one particular thing. Even as teen love and romance, it's obviously something where we want to kind of be with the teen and validating how intense that experience is. Or maybe, we didn't do well on this quiz or this test, or we didn't make that particular group, but there's always the next tryout, or there's always the next opportunity to check with the teacher, better clarify our study plan, get a little bit more sleep, and kind of think about how we can return to a more situational and contextualized way of understanding that failure or that rejection with lessons learned for the future in how we can help them be resilient and persistent. Our next question. My teen says school doesn't matter and they're just done. How can I motivate them without adding more pressure? We see this a lot because there's a lot of pressure, particularly associated with the high school years, and especially centered around kind of what teens are doing for their careers, what they might be doing after high school, whether or not they're planning to apply to college, whether or not they're planning to go to college, what type of college they're in line to have as their target or reach or safety or whatever other categories you might have. So there's just a ton of pressure around academics. There's also all kinds of ways that we communicate to teens that they're either succeeding or not, even outside of being graded. Lots of schools have track classes, AP classes, advanced classes. And for those teens who don't feel like they're succeeding, if they've been placed in advanced classes and then can't seem to keep up, or if they feel like they weren't actually able to get into advanced classes, and so for that reason they feel like their classes might be less than, there's so much pressure. So first and foremost, we try not to add to that. We validate the fact that those pressures exist. We say, I know there's all these kinds of things that you're juggling academically. How can I help you to just focus on what's right in front of you? Because this is the thing about, school and kind of teens saying that they're done. More often than not, they're looking at school globally, or they're looking at how far away the finish line might be. and they're saying, oh my God, it's so far away. I can't stand my high school, or I can't stand the kids that I go to school with, or this teacher is just mean and they're going to follow me forever and, ruin my high school experience. And all we're trying to pivot someone to is being able to say, not every teacher is going to be totally supportive, but there might be people who are in your corner. Not every friend is going to be completely nice, but there might still be peers you can connect with. You're not going to have academic success everywhere, but there might still be academic successes we can help you to find. Let's just think about what we're doing tomorrow, the next day, the next week, and kind of incrementalize this so we can think about just putting one foot in front of the other in our gradual steps. And at the end of the day, even if a teenager says, I don't know that any of that's going to really improve this, we can help them to get through things where they just may be unhappy. And that's a key thing for adolescence. When we talk to teenagers, not every teenager finds success with their friends or in romance or academically. And so we want to be aware of the fact that as we're coaching teens through this experience, sometimes the only way out is through. But we can be with them on that journey in helping them get through. So, next question. How do I take on the boyfriend topic in a household? So this question is interesting because I was talking with our marketing and communications team before we answered this, and we were kind of thinking like, what context do we want to add to the how do I take on the boyfriend topic question? Because what we're assuming in terms of context is that what a parent listener was asking here is, how do I take on the topic of romantic relationships? What appropriate conduct might be around a romantic partner, boyfriend or girlfriend within the house? What are my rules about, should someone be dating, who they're dating, and how I behave around it? There is a lot to unpack about just that question. What I would say is a lot of these questions are unpacked in an episode that we have upcoming with Dr. Angela Glimp from Peer Health Exchange on sex, consent, and safety, where we do talk about a lot of romantic aspects of teen relationships, as Dr. Dominguez and I also did in this episode. But even beyond, that the things that are discussed on those two podcast episodes, what I would just say about teen romantic relationships is this. You can't necessarily choose who your kids are interested in romantically. You can't necessarily choose the partner for them. But what you want them to think about is what they're looking for out of romantic relationships. That is often like the kind of values-driven conversation you can start having at early ages. So in that sense, even before they reach the teenage years, talking to them about what you look for in romantic partners. Do you look for kindness? Do you look for someone who's considerate? Do you look for someone who's funny? Do you look for someone who's very pretty? Any number of things that you might look for, and how you kind of weigh those factors in thinking about someone you might want to be romantically involved with. Then you also talk about relationships. This is another big piece that teens don't get a lot of communication about, where it's kind of like what relationships are like, how much fighting is kind of typical for any sort of relationship, how you argue, what you think good arguing looks like in a relationship, how you think that romantic partners should support each other, how you see that kind of support in your relationships with your partners. There's so much that we can just kind of be talking about explicitly in those, elementary school, tween, and teen years, just about our relationships we see on television with television characters and movie characters that we're watching with people, and just kind of talking about those different values. And then beyond that, it's that when teens are pursuing romantic relationships, we want to have kind of two conversations. One conversation may be thinking about what your boundaries are related to those relationships in the household, and what might happen when that romantic partner comes over to visit, or what your hopes are for how they will treat that relationship and do so respectfully according to the rules of your family. And then beyond that, we're also kind of talking about how they're navigating that relationship. So we want to leave there as an open line of communication where even if your teenager's not talking to you about those things, keep signaling that you're open to it. Hey, I know you just started in your relationship with Anthony, or I know you just started in your relationship with Grace. I just want you to know, I'm here if you need to talk. I'm here if you're, if you have any questions about things, or if you're trying to navigate stuff. And I think the last topic that we always get into that parents are really concerned about, and this is why we did a whole episode on sex, consent, and safety, is trying to make sure that teens have thought through how much knowledge they have about the physical boundaries in a relationship, how much they are thinking about their own kind of consent and boundaries that they want to communicate to their partner, and at the same time, how they're communicating about how they want to confront those particular things with their romantic partner. There are so many aspects of this where we want parents to be conduits of good information for kids about sex and safety, and where we want to make sure that kids are getting this information from trusted adults, because as much as teens say that it's incredibly awkward to talk to a parent about this, research shows that teens actually rate their parents as the person that they would most like to receive this kind of information from in informing how they might behave romantically. So there's just a lot to unpack about that question. I hope I give a few nuggets that send people either down internet search rabbit holes, to our show notes, to childmind.org, where we unpack these questions, or to our other podcast episodes on thriving kids here. The next question is actually my favorite of the entire bunch, so kudos to the listener who submitted this one. How do I support my teens' mental health when they won't talk to me about how they're feeling? This is an incredible question because it relates to earlier questions we've had during this episode about teenage irritability and teenagers being kind of closed out. But when we look at how you support your teens' mental health, a lot of teens don't want to talk about how they're feeling. And they'll come into sessions and do the same thing. We'll kind of say, like, how was this week? And they'll say, I don't want to talk about it. And we'll say, well, was there anything going on with, your boyfriend or girlfriend or with your friends this week? I don't want to talk about it. Anything going on with your parents? I don't want to talk about this. Why am I here? We can skip forward in those conversations to what we know to be the good coping skills that teens can be engaging in that will boost their mood or help them with managing stress, even if they don't tell us exactly how they're feeling or why they're feeling a certain way. So just to give that kind of breakdown, and I actually talk about this with a colleague of mine, Dr. Lisa Pressman, on her Raising Good Humans podcast a great deal. We have a whole hour kind of talking about cognitive behavioral therapy and the various skills we teach. But just to give kind of the breakdown, we can say to a teen, first line of defense for teenagers struggling with their mood or stress is behavioral activation. And what that means is that we will help teens think, what are activities that are de-stressing or help to fill your cup that take a minute, that take 30 seconds, that take 5 minutes, that take 10 minutes, that you can do when you have a moment on the weekend, any number of things. And how do we kind of pepper your days, and particularly ahead of moments of stress for you, with some of those activations? And what's, oftentimes the journey for teenagers, they'll tell us, because they're feeling stressed or because they're feeling down, these things won't work for me. And I'll say, I just want you to take a walk through your neighborhood tomorrow afternoon. And more often than not, someone comes back and says, that actually did feel better. Like, you were totally right. Or I'll say, I want you to do a 1-minute body scan using any mindfulness or meditation app. And the teen will come back and say, I can't believe it. Like, that felt so awkward, but at the same time, it did feel really good just to focus on my breath for 1 minute. And so that's really what we'll kind of push, is that even if a teen won't talk to us about how they're feeling, we can give them a number of options for behavioral activation and try to give them options to kind of activate themselves, cope with stress, perhaps fill their cup. A second thing that we can really focus on is their basic wellness habits. So if we want to help somebody to feel better, the amount of sleep they're getting, how they're eating regularly, whether or not they're hydrating, whether or not they're moving their body, these are core to whether or not someone is feeling their best. So the more we can help teens to think about their routines around those habits, and then to think about how we might be able to tweak certain things, that might also affect the stress or the mood that they're in without even talking about things. And then the last category that I'll look at is social support, where I'll say to somebody, you don't have to talk to me about how you're feeling. You don't have to tell me why you're feeling that way, but who are your village? I want to be part of your village. And I'm here for it, and I'll sit here and just eat some breakfast with you in silence, at our local diner if you want to, but let's figure out who else is in the village and who you could rely on, who you might want to engage for activities. You don't necessarily have to go out and talk to them about everything that's going on, but how do we engage that support so that you feel less alone, even if these folks don't exactly know what's going on? And those things can be really transformative, even if a teen will not tell you a thing. The next question. How do I help my teen build confidence when they're comparing themselves to everyone around them, especially on social media? So this is great because we've gotten this question. We can see how prominent this is in parents and caregivers' minds, because we also got this question in the Q&A episode after our self-esteem podcast with Dr. Jenny Louie. So I also talked about this question related to social comparison effects, online. And this is something where, just to kind of rephrase that particular answer, for those of you who don't want to go and find it in the self-esteem episode, it's around minute 5 of the Q&A episode. But what I'll say is that that particular answer was that we want teens to think critically about what they're seeing online. It's that when they look across, what they're being fed on social media, it's to remind them that they are the product. These things were created to keep their eyeballs on it for as long as possible. And frequently what that means is that what they're being fed are these moments that look like they're easy ways of finding satisfaction and joy in life. They're seeing their friends at their prettiest or at their best moments or at their most joyful, or all these types of things that make it seem like everybody else's life is more bejeweled than it actually would be in reality. And so because you're looking at people who are prettier due to filters or any number of editing tools, people who are having more fun, or people who are, engaging in all kinds of practices that have bettered their life and wellness in ways heretofore like completely untold or unknown in humanity, it can feel like everybody else is having a better time. And the reality is that's just the narrative they're feeding you. So how do we appreciate in our own lives those moments of joy, those high points? How do we appreciate in our own lives ourselves and feel confident in our body, in our skin, in our identity? And how do we also think about how we can kind of maybe consider our diet in what we're being fed of those sorts of sources and how it's affecting us? And if it's affecting us negatively, how do we re-engage with things other than that kind of feed of social media and social comparison that can help us to feel more healthy or lower levels of stress? The next question: how can I tell the difference between normal teenage moodiness and something more serious like depression? So we talk a little bit about this in a number of other, podcast episodes, but I also want to summarize it more here because this is another really important question. You'll hear me say on other podcast episodes that we look at mental health and learning disorders via a set of criteria called FITDI. And what that means, I think I talked about this on Masterclass as well, we're looking at frequency, intensity, duration, and impairment. So almost any diagnosis in mental health includes symptoms that people experience on any given day. They might be anxious, they might experience really stressful events, they might feel sad or down at certain points, they might feel unfocused or inattentive, they might have difficulties with some sorts of social interactions, things like that. When we ask about symptoms, we're not just asking about that behavior, we're also assessing how frequently or how often it happens, how intense it is when it happens, how long it's been happening, how persistent that problem has been, and then how impairing it is of that person's functioning at school, at home, with their family, with their friends, with any aspect of their life they might care about, or at work, things like that. And so as we assess, the diagnosis isn't just the symptoms themselves, it's how many of those symptoms are occurring all together, and then how much they're frequent, intense, happening for a long time and impairing that person's functioning. When we look at teenage moodiness, we expect a certain level of teenage moodiness. At the same time, we also know that the teenage years are a major developmental period in which early mood concerns and depression emerge for people. So with that in mind, we want to take it seriously. If you notice symptoms of depression in your teenager, it's a good idea to maybe talk about speaking to a school counselor or getting in touch with a therapist, hopefully through insurance coverage or through a recommendation from someone in your community, or speaking to another community support person that you feel like, maybe your teen can speak to someone in the village just about how they're feeling and whether or not there's a need for greater support. And what we're looking for in depression is we're looking for whether or not someone is really sad or down. We're looking for them, whether or not they're really irritable. We're looking for whether or not they've lost interest in things they once found to be pleasurable or interesting or fun. We're looking for big changes in sleep and eating patterns. We're looking for changes in their outlook on life, so a lot more negative thinking, or saying that they're hopeless about the future, or feeling really negatively or down about themselves, or kind of making a lot of negative self-statements. And we're also looking for any tendency to think that either life isn't worth living, or think about death more, or think about harming themselves, which are, immensely important things to assess for. And one last thing I will just say to all the parent listeners out there: you do not make someone suicidal by talking about suicide. And to phrase that in a not double negative here, talking about suicide helps people to find support, helps people to not feel alone, to feel like they are supported by their community. Just bringing up the word doesn't introduce the idea, doesn't make it so that someone who might not have been suicidal is suicidal. It is more important to talk about it. Kids do better when they're not in the dark. And we want to normalize asking teens if they or anyone they know seem to be thinking about death or seem to be feeling like life isn't worth it, or anything that we can do to help and support them, connect them to crisis services, connect them to our resources, whatever we can possibly do. Our next question: how do I talk to my teen about things like vaping or sneaking out without making them shut down? So what this question is getting to, and it's kind of drilling down on a few more behaviors of concern that earlier questions got to, is just that there are, the first thing that's mentioned in this question is vaping, which is something that has come about over the course of the last few years for teens. And really, it's not just vaping. It's also a slew of other tobacco nicotine-related products that have become quite widespread for teens where, while research might show that teens today are smoking fewer cigarettes, what we think is actually happening is they've just kind of broadened the number of different products that they might be using in the tobacco and nicotine realm. And at the end of the day, nothing is safe. Nothing is going to be non-addictive, or to phrase that a little bit more in a different way, these things are unsafe. These things are addictive. And at the same time, they're going to have health consequences. So what we want kids to be thinking about is the health risks of these types of things, and to treat vaping or something like that just the same way we would any other conversation about substances and substance abuse, which, you are in luck, a later podcast episode that we'll be releasing, I think in late fall, maybe early winter, is going to be about drugs, alcohol, and having conversations with kids about substance abuse. But at the end of the day, the way that if we want to boil it down to like one sentence in talking about things like teenage drug use, one of the things that we'll say to parents is you want to be clear about your boundaries and clear about the fact that you don't want your teen to use. And then at the same time, there's a kind of yes and to this. You want to let teens know that if they get into trouble, whether you say the punishment might be less or whether you say, I always want to know, whatever it is, you're communicating to them, if you get into trouble, I want to know about it and I want to help you. Even though I don't want you to use and I don't think it's healthy for you and your developing brain, and there's no way that you can make a case that drugs are good at this age for the developing brain. Now, going back to the original question, which was how do you talk about these things without having a teen shut down? We can't guarantee that a teen's not going to shut down. But what we can say is that it can help to preview the conversation up front, to say to a teen, look, I'm going to talk about something awkward. I'm going to try to talk about it briefly. I just want to get across a couple things I've been thinking about. If you can let me say them, let me say them. If you want to respond. If you want to come back and have a conversation with about it later on, happy to do that. But let me just kind of get this out there, and then I'm open to any back and forth you might want to engage in. We see if we can get that going. Our second to last question for this episode: how do I get my teen to open up about their friendships? So with friendships, when we're thinking about how to get people to open up, and I've referenced this in a few of the other answers, getting people to open up tends to be because we engage in a few predictable ways of reacting to what they're sharing with us. So if we ask them about a friend, or if we ask them about a social event, what we want to do is keep ourselves regulated. We want to reflect what they're saying, which means basically you're just kind of paraphrasing it, saying, oh, okay, the party this weekend sounds like it was kind of crazy. Or, you're telling me that there's a lot of stuff going on and who some of your friends are dating. Or, yeah, I didn't realize that was happening to Susan. All we're doing is trying to reflect. And then at the same time, we're really thinking about our role as either listeners or problem solvers. Most teens will say they only want you to help them problem solve if they ask for it. You may have difficulty holding yourself back, but if you can think in your mind, I'm going to listen instead of problem solve as much as I can, you're more likely to see a teen open up about their friendships, because that's going to create kind of a non-judgmental space where they feel like they can kind of talk about what's going on, and you're not going to freak out or tell them you're going to call this person's mother or say that, no one in teenage history has ever done these kinds of things, and, you're never going to be seeing this particular friend again. Stay regulated. Reflect what you're hearing. And, if you do feel yourself just being pulled to be like, oh my God, I have to say something, I would just kind of preface that and say it to a teen hey, can I just offer a suggestion? I mean, take it or leave it, but let me just offer one and just you see what's up, but, giving them a sense of agency and choice in how they want to kind of adopt whatever advice you might be giving. Our last question for this particular podcast Q&A episode What can I do when my teen says they don't care about anything anymore? So this relates to an earlier question that we had related to when you should be concerned about your teen in terms of normal teenage moodiness, something more serious like depression. This can be one of those signs that we're worried about, where a teen might be experiencing depression, where we'd say it's a good idea to speak to a school counselor or a mental health professional, where not caring about anything anymore there's a fancy clinical term for it, which is anhedonia. It's that a teenager is saying, I used to care about stuff, but now I don't. I don't even care about the stuff I used to think was fun. That can be an indicator that maybe they need more support, or maybe there is something else going on. At the same time, if it's short-lived, that can happen with almost any teenager, where for one reason or another, what it feels like in the face of the pressure they're facing or all the things they're juggling or all the things on their to-do list, it would just be better to say, I don't care, and kind of deny it and then just like shut it away and do something else. And my answer to parents is like, they might say like, he said he doesn't care and they did nothing the rest of Saturday, even when we know he's got X and Y that he's got to do for Monday. And I would say any given day might just be the battle, but not the war. So if you're seeing this as short-lived and it's just what your teen is saying and then how they're behaving in a short period of time, everybody has those phases where they just want to pull the covers over their head and shut themselves away from the world. The more you can be with them on the idea that that happens to people sometimes and isn't a problem for them in being able to cope with a real world and your concern about whether or not they'll be able to handle adult life, the more we can make it not like a global issue and more of like a local, like, how do I get you, to emerge from the bed tomorrow and perhaps feel like there's some stuff that we can incrementally start to tackle together, the more likely they are to talk to themselves like that in the future. And that's what helps them to maybe take problems one step at a time instead of feeling overwhelmed and like they have to kind of shut down fully. So, for those of you who've listened this far, that was the most questions we've ever tried to tackle in a Q&A episode, but if there's any topic that parents really like to talk about, it is teenagers, and that's why we tried to give you as much content as we can this week. Thank you for listening to Thriving Kids.